Well, thank you so much for attending this webinar on helping our children understand the reliability of the resurrection. For those of you who I've never met before, my name is Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and I run Foundation Worldview, which is a ministry that's designed to give Christian adults the tools that they need to equip the kids that God has placed in our care to carefully evaluate every idea they encounter and understand the truth of the biblical worldview. Now, for those of you who have been Christians for a while, I hope that you know that Christianity, the truth of Christianity, either rises or falls on the resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus rose from the grave, then Christianity is true. And as the Apostle Paul has said in 1 Corinthians 15, that if Christ has not been raised, we are still in our sins and our faith is futile. We of all people are most to be pitied. And so, if we want the children that God has placed in our care to understand the truth of the biblical worldview, we really have to start with the resurrection of Jesus. And that's why we're having this webinar this month, because we're just about a month out from Easter. And so, what better time than right before Easter to focus in on the resurrection of Jesus? Now, here to help me with this discussion today is my friend and resurrection expert, Dr. Michael Licona. So, Mike, welcome to this webinar, and thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you very
Well,
much, Elizabeth. It's wonderful to be with you.
yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. Actually, my own journey into apologetics, which started because of the kids in my classroom and my third graders, and just wanting to help them understand that Christianity is true. My own apologetics journey actually began with, I think it's the book that's based on your doctoral dissertation, The Resurrection of Jesus. And was this your dissertation? Is that correct?
It's a slightly modified version of it.
Okay. Well, you can see the modification. It's very, it's still very thick, folks. But so Dr. Licona, Mike is an expert on all things with the resurrection. So I'm so excited to have this discussion today. And so first, I just like to start off with the basics. As you're in, your PhD program, what led you actually to focus in on the resurrection? Of all topics that you could have possibly chosen, why the resurrection?
It's a fair question. Well, Gary Habermas and I had been in the midst of writing our book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus.
Hmm.
Well, we were maybe 2 years into it. We still had a ways to go. But I remember asking Gary, I said, you've got this bibliography of about 2,400 academic sources who have written on the resurrection since 1975. Now it's up to, I think, 4,500. It was
Wow.
like a 2,400 at that point, somewhere around there. And I said, why is it that they're looking at the same data and arriving at different conclusions? And who are
Hmm.
these scholars? And he said, well, almost all of them are New Testament scholars. There's a few philosophers and maybe just a handful at most of professional historians. And I thought, well,
Hmm.
yeah, but do any of these philosophers, do any of the New Testament scholars have any training on how to do historical investigation on something like this? How would a historian conduct it? Has any kind of, you know, really extensive historical investigation been made on the resurrection of
Hmm.
Jesus? And so I figured that's how I want to do it. I want to proceed as a historian would, using the tools of a historian. And so what my goal was to just come up with another apologetic argument for the resurrection of
Hmm.
Jesus. But shortly into it, I was learning that historians say that all historians are biased, and their biases
Hmm.
threaten to compromise the integrity of their investigation. And I said, well,
Hmm.
wait a minute, that applies to me. It applies to
Right.
all skeptics, and it applies to Christians as well. So it's like, wow, if I'm going to really do an honest investigation, I've got to take some serious steps to manage my bias and to put it up
Hmm.
on the shelf while I investigate. And so my objectives ended up changing about a year into my work. And now it's like,
Hmm.
I really want to see if historical investigation can honestly, authentically validate the resurrection of Jesus.
Hmm.
And so that's what got me into it.
Oh, I love that story, and I love how you specifically sought to take the approach of a historian. So, for those of you who are watching, I know that you're probably watching because you want to help your kids understand the truth of this. And something that I think is so important to talk through with our kids when we're talking with them about the resurrection is, what kind of people would study the resurrection? And as Mike mentioned, there's going to be theologians and there's going to be philosophers, but then also talk about what about historians, people that study history? Is this an event that a historian could actually study? And I think that's so important for our children because a lot of times we make this assumption that our kids already believe that the Bible is true. And you know what? When they're 5, they do because we tell them that. And we could tell them anything at the age of 5 and they are going to believe it. But around the age of 8, that's when God has designed them to start questioning things, to start wondering what is true. So for these children who, are not yet thoroughly convinced that scripture is true, this can be a great approach for us to look at with them. So now so Mike, in your book, specifically as you talk about in the beginning, just, the methodology, the method that you used when studying, historically what happened to Jesus, you talk about something called horizons. And I thought that was so fascinating when I read your book. So can you explain to us what horizons are and what role they played in your investigation?
Well, a horizon is our worldview. It's
Mhm.
our biases that are based on our race, gender, ethics, nationality, our political, religious, and philosophical convictions, the way we were raised, the academic institutions we attended, and the very group of people whose acceptance and respect we desire. All of
Mhm.
these form a way of looking at the world. And that's how people it can look at the same data and arrive at radically different conclusions. In fact, they ignore certain things because it doesn't fit into their horizon. So it's kind of
Mhm.
like putting on a pair of sunglasses, and everybody's sunglasses are tinted differently, and it's the way we look
Mhm.
at the world. So it definitely, I mean, of course there's so many people who look at the same thing and disagree, and it's
Right.
because of our horizons.
Hmm. Right. And those of you who have gone through foundation comparative worldview curriculum with the kids in your care, you know that this is exactly what we're talking about in that curriculum. That our worldview, it's what we believe is true about life and the world around us. It's like this mental map that we use, or as Mike described, like a pair of sunglasses. And so you mentioned a little bit before, you kind of hinted at this, that in your investigation, you were trying to be as unbiased as possible. So, so to speak, you're trying to take off, your sunglasses as much as possible, your own horizons. So just like from a personal perspective, was that a little bit intimidating, as someone who had professed to be a Christian for a while, to try to say, okay, let me try as much as I can to look at this data objectively?
Yeah, I can remember really wrestling with this. And, I didn't tell a lot of people about it at the time because I
Hmm.
didn't, want to do anything that could rock their faith.
Hmm.
Um, Gary Habermas, my friend, knew about it. William Lane Craig knew about it. My doctoral supervisor, my wife knew about it. But beyond that, not, I rarely
Hmm.
shared it with people, but it's like I really wrestled. And it's because I was just trying to be as honest and open with the data as possible and thinking, we don't have to fear truth. What we do have to
Right.
fear is that our biases will be so strong that they will prevent us from discovering truth, and it costs us eternity. And
Hmm.
that was just something that just nagged at me. It kept me awake at
Hmm.
night. And so, yeah, I really wrestled with it.
Yeah, I can imagine. Actually, it was funny. So when I took this book off my shelf for the interview, you know how like you have like associations with things and you have physical reactions. I actually got a stomach ache when I pulled it off the shelf, not because it was a bad book, but I just remember for myself, even knowing, that eventually your conclusion was most likely going to be that Jesus rose from the grave. I remember being intimidated to just reading through it and being like, what if I read this, like all the data that you've collected and I don't agree? Like what if I actually think that there's a more compelling case elsewhere for what happened to Jesus? I was like, then I have two options. Like I either have to abandon everything that I have, professed for the past, 20 something years, or I'm going to have to live a lie. So I can only imagine for you that that was very intimidating. So hopefully for those of you watching that this is encouraging for you to know that Mike took all of these steps, to try to be as objective as possible. And here he is before us today, still a professing Christian. Now, another thing that I found interesting is in your investigation, you went through and you outlined different historical sources pertaining to the resurrection. of Jesus. Now, obviously, we don't have multiple hours to go through all of these things as you probably could lead us through. But just, could you give us a summary of what are some of those historical sources that have to do with the resurrection of Jesus?
Sure. Well, immediately the Gospels come to mind, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and
Hmm.
John, because they provide a narrative of the resurrection. And three of the four, all but Mark, give us a narrative of some of the appearances. So we look at those. Now, in the book, I didn't spend a whole lot of time with the Gospels in that sense because I recognized up front that this the reliability of the Gospels, even things like the authorship of the Gospels, is hotly debated by scholars. And
Hmm.
I was more interested in finding common ground, something not for the sake of peace, but finding common ground, things that facts that were so strongly supported by the data that virtually all scholars, no matter how skeptical, granted them,
Hmm.
and just to see how far such facts could take us with the resurrection. Again, because I knew that my bias, my personal biases, would motivate me to accept things more
Hmm.
readily than maybe I should.
Right.
In other words, I would probably believe the Gospels are historically reliable. I would be more ready to accept that they're reliable than a skeptic would. Now, a skeptic may be too reticent to do it, but I might be too willing to do it.
Hmm.
And so that's what kind of I just kind of said, all right, let's kind of bracket the Gospels and we'll say, well, that possibly gives us some good things. Now, deep down inside, I felt that they were more reliable than what I granted in the book. And since then, I feel like I'm more prepared to argue in that sense.
Hmm.
Um, but I looked at some of the Gnostic sources, and of course, those are just later. And you even have people like Bart Ehrman, who refers to himself as an agnostic atheist, and he's probably the most influential skeptical New Testament scholar in the world today. And he says that, look, these other, Gnostic and non canonical gospels and literature, they inform us what some Christians thought in the second and third centuries. But if you really want to know about the real Jesus, there's only one place to go. And he says that's the Gospels. And he says this is not for
Hmm.
theological reasons, it's for historical reasons, pure and simple. That's pretty much a quote of what he said.
Hmm.
I think by far the best source we have for the resurrection of Jesus is Paul. And the reason
Hmm.
being is because of the 13 letters that are attributed to Paul in the New Testament, scholars are pretty unanimous that he wrote at least 7 of them. And then they debate over the other 6. And of those 6, I'd say uh, 2 or 3 of them, a majority would say he wrote, and then 3 of them, a majority would say he probably didn't write. And of course, I'm saying evangelical, moderate, skeptical, they're very skeptical. I'm including all of them, the tens of thousands of them. All right. So,
Right.
so even if we just take the undisputed letters of Paul, the 7 of them, but just mainly looking at, say, Galatians and First Corinthians, we can come up with a lot of data from Paul,
Hmm.
and we can show that he had some oral tradition that predates him and almost certainly goes back to the Jerusalem apostles that have them claiming about the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus and subsequent appearances to individuals and to groups.
Hmm.
So those things, that's pretty cool stuff. And scholars, even
Yeah.
skeptical ones, are willing to grant that.
Yeah. Well, I love how you explained there that, like you're just focusing on the things that pretty much everyone would agree on. You're not saying that things that are disputed means that they're definitely not written by Paul, but you're just saying, okay, like what is something that everybody agrees on. So for those of you watching who are thinking like, okay, Elizabeth, like there's no way my kid is going to read this doctoral dissertation. You're absolutely right. But I think there are some interesting things that you could do with your kids, just thinking about these two sources that Mike just recommended. So, thinking about Galatians and thinking about First Corinthians. If in your family devotional time just before Easter, you read through these two letters and said, you know what, as a family, we're going to go on this investigation and we're going to see what is everything that Paul says about Jesus's resurrection in these two letters. And so if you just go through and you read through it and say, okay, we're going to keep a running list of that, and you read through those two books and then keep that running list, I think that you'd be really surprised at all of the things that you find that Paul does say about that. And then you can talk about that with your kids and say, you know what, even people who don't believe that the Bible is God's word, and you know what, even people, who don't believe that Jesus actually rose from the grave, these are letters that they would agree were written by Paul, and they were written, just a couple or few decades after Jesus was crucified. So just to show your kids that, you know what, it's not just, people who believe that scripture is inspired and authoritative and inerrant, who hold that these are actually written by Paul and are written closely after when Jesus died and was supposedly raised, but it's even those who are skeptical. So I think that's a great activity that you could do with your kids. Now, another thing, Mike, after you,
Elizabeth, can
oh,
I add something?
yes,
I,
please
I
do.
love the last thing that you said there, and that is, you said, look, um, you can get to these kind of conclusions. This is based on what even some skeptical scholars say, just looking at the literature. So they're not looking at First Corinthians and Galatians and some of these others in view of them being divinely inspired or
Mhm.
God's inerrant word. They're just looking at them for what everybody would acknowledge. They are first century letters
Mm,
written by someone who claims to be an eyewitness of the risen Jesus and who knew others who claimed to be an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. So yeah, you can get there without the inspiration and inerrancy of the Bible. It's just by looking at it as for something that everyone would agree that it is at minimal, and that is first century literature.
right. No, thank you. Thank you for highlighting that, Mike, because I think that is a really important thing for our kids to understand. Because, one day when they are encountering someone who's very skeptical, or they hear another claim, that opposes things that, we as parents or Christian educators or church leaders are trying to teach them, we want our kids to have that grounding of knowing, like, hold on, like, even if we take away, all of Christian theology, like, or people that are holding to these doctrines, we know that we can view these documents as historical. So thank you for zeroing in on that, Mike. Now, the next section of your book, you talk about more historical sources, but you talk about historical bedrock pertaining to the fate of Jesus. So can you explain to us first what you mean by historical bedrock, and
Hmm.
then what some of that bedrock is that you investigated?
Yeah. So I think we can all acknowledge that some facts are just better attested than others. No one really questioned, well, I'd say Muslims do, but no historians really question whether Jesus died by crucifixion uh, due to the orders of the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. The evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion is overwhelming. Okay, in fact, you'll have skeptical scholars like John Dominic Crossan and Bart Ehrman saying that Jesus' death by crucifixion is one of the best attested facts of the ancient world. So we know that. But what about um, Jesus's virgin birth? Well, that doesn't have anywhere near the kind of evidence in its favor as we have for the uh, the death of Jesus by crucifixion. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't believe that Jesus was born of a virgin. It's just being honest and saying we don't have as much evidence for it, not even close to the amount of evidence
Mhm.
that we have for Jesus's death by crucifixion. Now, with that said, understanding that some facts are better attested than others, there, we have more reason to believe them than we do for others. Historical bedrock is a term that I'm borrowing from um, Paula Fredrickson, who is a Jewish New Testament scholar and not a Christian. And she talked about the disciples' beliefs that they had seen the risen Jesus. She called it historical bedrock, facts beyond doubt.
Mhm.
So I like that term because I imagine the strength of different things. And, bedrock is like it's immovable. That is the
Right.
like really strong foundation. And then above that, you've got some other ground that, well, it's not quite as strong, but it's still really strong. And then as you go up on the levels, the stratums, you get to the top and you get some kind of really soft ground. So it's like bedrock, you want to formulate the foundation of your
Mm.
hypothesis on historical bedrock, which would be those facts that are so strongly supported by the data that they are pretty much beyond doubt. And
Mhm.
so that's what historical bedrock is.
Oh, I think that's a great analogy, and for those of you watching, I hope that you were thinking like, "Oh, this is an analogy that my children can understand," because our kids, they understand, the strength of different things, even if they don't understand what bedrock is. I mean, you can have a fun science lesson on that, and that could be a good thing to do, but even just understanding, like, the foundation of a house, something that is solid, and if we're going to make a prediction about something that happened and then look for evidence for it, to either confirm or deny that, we're going to want to make sure that it's resting on something that is sound. For those of you who have taken the Kids in Your Care through Foundation Careful Thinking curriculum, you know that this is something that we cover as we go throughout the curriculum. We talk about knowledge in the fourth unit and how we can have different levels of certainty with different pieces of knowledge. There's some facts that we can have, very high levels of confidence in. And then there's other facts where we're like, well, you know what? It's not necessarily the highest possible probability, but it's more plausible than not. And we don't use the word plausible in that curriculum. We talk about more likely than not. But, like if we're going to be investigating something historically and building a conclusion on it, we want to make sure that it's on that bedrock. So, did I explain that correctly, Mike, or were there any corrections that you would have there?
No, no, no. That's perfect. In fact, you said something that reminded me of the end of, like the foundation of a house, and it reminded me of the end of Jesus's Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7.
Mm,
About the wise man who builds his house on rock, and then
yeah,
the foolish man who builds his house on sand. It's you
yeah.
want that rock, that bedrock. So, if a if a hypothesis can't even account for the bedrock historical data, then you know that that hypothesis is just simply mistaken. You want to
Mhm.
go with the strongest facts
Right.
first, and then if needed, you build upon those.
Right. Well, so can you tell us for the resurrection, what is some of that historical bedrock upon which you built or upon which anybody, should really build in this investigation?
Well, first we'd say Jesus' death by crucifixion, and if Jesus
Mhm.
died by crucifixion, then hypotheses that he survived his death, which are easily refuted anyway, but they need
Mhm.
not be given serious attention once you know that, look at all the data for it. Um, you Historical bedrock, again, strongly supported by the data and has persuaded nearly all scholars, no matter how skeptical, to grant them as facts. That would be that subsequent to Jesus' death, shortly thereafter, a number of his followers had experiences they
Mm.
interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to them. Now, that is not to say that they grant that Jesus appeared to them and rose from the
Right.
dead. It is to say that something happened that they interpreted as Jesus rising from the dead and appearing to them. That's what virtually all scholars will grant you. So you've got to be able to account for that. And then, same thing about Paul. Paul was a non believer, he was hostile to the Christian church. He was persecuting Christians, arresting them, throwing them into prison for being, excuse me, being Christians. And then he became one because he had an experience he interpreted
Mhm.
as an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. Now, those are things that virtually 100% of scholars grant today. Now, if you want to go with maybe 80 to 90%, which is still really good,
Right.
then I would add things such as, um, 80 to 90% of scholars will grant that Jesus' disciples claimed that they had some of these experiences in group settings. In other words,
Mm.
groups of people had an experience where they said Jesus, the risen Jesus, had appeared to them. And it was so similar that they thought they were having the same experience. So that kind of rules out a group hallucination, because hallucination, well, we'll probably get to that, I'm sure. But um, so also, uh, James, the brother of Jesus,
Mm.
about 90% of scholars who comment on this would say that James was a non-believer all the way up until Jesus was killed, was crucified and died. And even at that point, he was a non-believer. And then shortly thereafter, he had an experience he interpreted as his brother, having been raised from the dead and appearing to him. Now, the reason I didn't include that in my book is because of the hundreds of scholars who write on the resurrection, and I mean hundreds, um, maybe over 600 scholars who have written on it, maybe close to 1,000. I don't know.
Mhm.
Um, I could only find 29 who commented on the appearance to James.
Hmm.
Now, there might be
Interesting.
more by now, and I might have missed some. And it was a heterogeneous consensus. So you had skeptic and believer or not. But I figured only 29 out of hundreds. Boy, I'd sure like to have more scholars commenting on this before I render a judgment. Now, Gary Habermas says, well, the data is there. And the fact that a lot of scholars don't count on it, that's not our problem. And I think he's right to an extent. But remember, what I'm doing is I'm trying to be as fair-minded. I'm not acting as a
Right.
Christian apologist. I'm trying to be as fair-minded and as cautious as possible. And I'm going to err on the side of caution. That was my whole means of pursuing truth in this
Hmm.
investigation.
Yeah, well, for everyone watching, I hope that you hear just how very cautious and thorough Mike was throughout this entire investigation. And those three things that he mentioned earlier as historical bedrock, that Jesus died by crucifixion, that the disciples had experiences that they interpreted as experiences of seeing the risen Jesus, and then that Paul was transformed by an experience he interpreted as seeing the risen Jesus. I mean, just think about how easy those things would be to explain to kids that, like virtually all historians agree that Jesus died on the cross, that the disciples thought that they saw him resurrected, and that the apostle Paul was changed because he thought he saw Jesus as well. So those are three things that are very easily relatable to kids. We can very easily explain it. If you want them, to think through that and to remember it, you can even tell them those three pieces of data and you can have them draw pictures. Just I want you to draw a symbol that's going to remind you what are the three pieces of historical bedrock upon which we can conduct this investigation. And then if you're looking for either even further resources, for those of you who are members of the Foundation Worldview Book Club, this month in our book club, the book that we recommended for 8 to 12-year-olds is How Do We Know Christianity is Really True by Chris Morphew. And he goes through those things in that chapter book for 8 to 12-year-olds. And then for kids 7 and younger, we recommended Possums and the Empty Tomb. And that's something in that picture book that they cover that bedrock as well. So if you're looking for easy sources to go through that with your kids, those two books are excellent. Now, Mike, in the next section, or in the final section of your book, what you did is you went through and you weighed different hypotheses and the strength of different hypotheses, according to a certain, I don't even know how to say it. You used some objective scale to do that. Obviously now we do not have time to discuss all of them, but I was wondering if you could just briefly explain to us how you went about, evaluating the strength of different hypotheses. And then I was also curious if you found any of the other hypotheses of what happened to Jesus compelling as you did your research.
Mm. Well, there were several criteria that I used, such as
Criteria, that's the word.
yeah, explanatory scope, explanatory power, less ad hoc, plausibility.
Mm,
Um, but in lectures to non-academic crowds, I just try to make it as simple as possible. And we just consider the one, and that's explanatory scope. In other words,
mm,
which hypothesis can explain or account for just the historical bedrock, which
mm,
best accounts for those. And so what I'll do is I'll put up like a traffic light. And is it green? Is it amber? Or is it red? If
mm,
it passes the test, it gets a green. If it fails it, it gets a red. If it's, well, maybe, or something qualified, then it gets an amber. And so when you look at that, and I have these slides, and I'll have the traffic lights, and I'll show for every one of those historical bedrock, does it
mm,
get a green, amber, or red light? Well, resurrection hypothesis will have far more green lights than any of the other hypotheses, and therefore it
mm,
explains the data better than any other hypothesis. And historians would say the hypothesis that best accounts for the data should be regarded as what probably occurred.
mm,
Again, we can't get into a time machine and go to the past and verify the conclusion. So all we can say is probable as historians. But we do everything in life based on probability, right? You
Right.
you travel a lot, Elizabeth. You fly all over the country and lecture and teach folks. You don't know when you get on that plane with absolute certainty that you are going to land safely. Sometimes planes drop out of the sky and people die. But you get on that plane because based on the data, it's probable. There's a high degree of
Mm,
probability that you're going to make it safely. And so that's what we do. I mean, there's an element of faith, no matter how much the evidence is. And even if we had the resurrection on video, and by the way, if the Shroud of Turin is authentic, we have a photograph of the resurrection.
hmm,
But even if we had it on video, we could still say, well, maybe it's an alien from a parallel universe somewhere who's, in order to get their PhD, they have to trick people on Earth in order to believe that they're God. And so it was just this alien tricking people into believing Christianity is true. I mean, you'd have to say, well, that's a possibility,
right.
you still have to have faith. And even if you're an atheist, you have to have faith because you've got to be able to explain so much phenomena that doesn't fit into atheism. So
Mm.
no matter what a person's worldview, you're still going to have faith, but we are looking for the most reasonable explanation, the one that can explain the historical bedrock better than any other hypothesis.
Oh, I love that, the example that you gave of the traffic light, because I think that's just a really clear visual of, okay, how, how does this hypothesis measure up? And you talked about, is it explanatory power? Was that the term that you used? The power to explain
Explanatory
all the different
scope.
explanatory scope. Thank you. Sorry, I missed that there. But like, what is the explanatory scope? And we're not going to use that term with kids, but we can just say what best explains these three pieces of historical bedrock. So the ones that we just went through before, that Jesus died by crucifixion, the apostles claimed that they saw him, and Paul was transformed because of what he claimed was an appearance of Jesus. And then go through different theories of what happened to Jesus. And I think with our kids, that red, yellow, green light is something that we can, obviously say is like, it would be very helpful for them. Like the alien theory. Well, maybe Jesus was an alien, and talking about that, is that able to explain these different things? And red, yellow, or green. So for those of you working with kids, I think that can be a great activity that you can do with them. If you're interested, we don't have time today to dive down deep into theories of what, the other hypotheses of what happened to Jesus. But if you're interested in more information on that, about a year ago, before Easter last year, I did another webinar on the resurrection where we just went through what are some of the top three most popular theories of what happened to Jesus, in theories that are not the resurrection. So if you're interested in more information about that, Jonathan will put a link to that in the chat so you can go check that out. And then I did not talk about that red, yellow, green light last year. So that can be a great activity that you can add to that. Now, we are going to head into our time of questions in about 5 minutes. So this is just a reminder that if you have questions about anything that was said, please feel free to put them in the questions tab, not in the general chat. Put them in the questions tab. We have it set so that you are the only one who will be able to see your question. It'll be anonymous, so don't be shy about putting it there. So if you have any questions about the research that Mike has done or anything he has shared, or if you have any questions about, okay, the things that you heard and how it can be translated down for the kids that God has placed in your care, please put those in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. So, Mike, just as we wrap up this conversation, obviously, as we've already modeled with the thickness of your book, your work on the resurrection is very extensive. We've just like skimmed the surface of it today. However, if you had, like if you were just in a conversation with someone very briefly, one of those elevator conversations, maybe longer than an elevator, maybe if you had like, 3 to 5 minutes to talk with someone about why you came to the conclusion that the resurrection of Jesus is the best hypothesis of what occurred. How would you explain that to someone just in a few minutes?
Well, I would first point out that there are a number of facts that are so strongly supported by the data that they have compelled an overwhelming majority of
Mm,
scholars, almost 100%, to grant them as facts.
mm,
And one of those is not only Jesus' death by crucifixion, but also that shortly after his death, a number of his followers had experiences of what they interpreted to be the risen Jesus to them. and that you also have a skeptic, a persecutor of the Christian church named Paul, who
Mm,
likewise had an experience of what he interpreted as the risen Jesus, and it radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Now, what historians have to do is to be able to explain these things. And the hypothesis that best explains these is what is regarded as what probably occurred. So then I'll just typically say, well, then there's the let's I can't go through all of them, but let's just look at the hallucination hypothesis, which is the most popular one offered by skeptics today. And I'll talk about how hallucinations are private occurrences in the mind of an
mm,
individual. They have no external reality. So, in that sense, they're like dreams. And just as I couldn't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a dream. I'm in Maui. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream. Let's have a free vacation. Um, we can't do that. You can't have a group hallucination as well because there's no external reality to what you're experiencing,
mm,
and it's not in a sleeping state. It's also only 7% of those who um, are in the okay. So over more than a century, they have found that the people most likely to experience a hallucination are people who are bereaving the loss of a loved one. Yet only
mm,
about 7% of them have experienced hallucinatory experiences of that loved one. Now, in contrast, not 7%, but an unthinkable 100% had experiences that they interpreted of the risen Jesus appearing to them.
mm.
And then also Paul. Paul is not grieving Jesus' death. He believed
Right.
Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet. So Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. There are other
Mm,
reasons as well, but we see the hallucination hypothesis doesn't do a good job at all of explaining the data. Um, it might be able to account for Jesus' death by crucifixion and why they were saddened afterward, but it
right.
really doesn't explain anything else. The resurrection hypothesis, in contrast, explains all of it perfectly. And so it's a much better explanation. And when we conduct the same kind of weighing of hypotheses, comparing hypotheses, the resurrection hypothesis comes out on top every time. There's not
Mm,
even a close second place.
mm. Wow. I think that's a great explanation. I love how I gave you I think I kinda threw you maybe that wasn't really a curveball that I threw you, but just trying to ask you to summarize so much of your work in, a few minutes, and so I think that's a really great explanation. So I hope for those of you watching, that you've been encouraged just to know that on a scholarly level, this much work has been done by Mike, and that he's come out with this conclusion, and just that there's very simple things that we can do with our kids to help them understand that no, it's not just that we believe that Jesus rose from the dead because we're Christians, but there's actually solid historical evidence for believing that this is the best explanation of what happened to Jesus and that this is where the data leads. Okay, we're going to transition now into our time of Q&A, but just as a little bit of housekeeping for those of you who typically attend Foundation Worldview webinars, you know that we typically have 2 per month. However, this month in March, this is going to be our only webinar of the month, and that is because Lord willing, in a week and a half from now, we're going to start filming our next curriculum for 4 to 7-year-olds on the attributes of God. So we're really excited about that, so stay tuned for that. And then our next webinar is going to be on Tuesday, April 4th at 1 p.m. Central. And it is going to be entitled Making Sure Our Kids Know God as He Is, Not as They Want Him to Be. So, how can we actually help our kids know who God actually is and not just be the God of their imagination? Okay, so we're transitioning into our time of questions. So the first question is, if our kids haven't questioned the resurrection, at what age should we begin talking about this with them? And I think that's a great question that a lot of times we assume if our children haven't asked us questions about something that we don't need to address this topic until they ask us questions. Where what we're really missing there is a lot of times, our kids, their minds are working all the time. They're always thinking. And so there are many questions that actually never make it to the surface. And so we're very wise to begin at a very young age, helping them understand that we can ask good questions. We can ask good questions, and it's actually a healthy thing to do, and it's a biblical thing to do, to use our minds for the glory of God. So I would recommend, even if you have a 3 or a 4-year-old, that book that I mentioned earlier, Possums and the Empty Tomb, get a copy of that book and start reading it to them this Easter, and then ask them questions. And actually, if you're part of our Foundation Worldview Book Club, we include questions that you can talk through with your kids along with discussion points throughout every book. So I would recommend that you start talking with your kids about this, as early as 3 or 4. Now, your kids aren't going to developmentally be at a place where they're going to be able to really critically think through some of this stuff until they're around 8 years old. Some kids it takes a little longer. It might be, until they're 9 or 10. Some kids it's a little younger. It might be at around 8 years of age, but you can have them start thinking through these things and start asking them questions. If we were wanting to invest this like historians, what are some things that we would want to look for? What are some things that would be important to look for? When historians look at different theories of what happened in history, what kind of data do they look for? What kind of evidence do they look for? When I was a classroom teacher, one thing I would do, I taught third grade. So I was teaching 8 and 9-year-olds. And every Easter, I would have my students, we would together read through the crucifixion and resurrection accounts in all 4 gospels. And we would note things that were similar and we would note things that were different about the accounts. And then I would break them into groups and I'd say, okay, there's a lot of differences here. There are a lot of things that are different. Does this mean that we cannot trust the gospels? And I mean, I'm sure some people watching are just like, oh my goodness, why on earth would you do that? Like, why would you get them thinking this way? But do we think they're never going to think that way, in the future? Don't we want to be the ones who are explaining, like, hey, we know that these are some things, these are some thoughts you're probably having. And you know what? That's a great thought because literally millions of people have had it before you. So let's look at this. And I was always so encouraged every year that most of my students would come to the conclusion that, like these differences that we find, they're not significant. And many of them can just be attributed to different perspectives and point of views, like the number of angels at the tomb and things like that. So I would recommend starting to talk to them about it at 3, 4 years of age and just continuing to build upon that. So, Mike, I know you are working at the very scholarly level, but I don't know, did you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, not at all. You are the expert in this area, and I respect you a lot. And I know that you just have some phenomenal resources, and you know what you're doing. So, I'll defer to you gladly there.
Okay. Okay, next question. Would you agree that the total transformation of the apostles from terrified to bold to the point of their willingness to die for their belief is also a very compelling argument? So, Mike, what are your thoughts of this? Just the total transformation of the apostles from terrified to bold to potential martyrs. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I do think it's compelling, but it's going to be compelling to different degrees with different people. So, for
Mm,
example, those of us who already are inclined to believe the Gospels, it's going to be very compelling to us, just because not only we believe the Gospels, but we know from someone to go from fearful to all of a sudden their doubts are gone, and now they're willing to lay down their lives and suffer for it. That transformation shows that they truly believed it, but that is going to depend on how reliable you think the Gospels are.
mm,
Skeptics who aren't so inclined to believe the reliability of the Gospels may not look at the transformation or accept that the disciples had transformed lives. I still think there's good reason to believe it, but
mm,
they may not be so inclined to believe that. However, in a case like that, we can still point out that there are a number of sources, even in the first century, that suggest that the disciples were willing to suffer and die for their gospel proclamation that Jesus had been raised. The earliest would have been Paul. In First Corinthians chapter 15, he talks about how he and the other disciples, he says, die daily. They face death daily. The dangers of proclaiming the gospel could have meant death to them at any day. Um,
mm,
you've got in John's gospel, the last chapter, you have Jesus tell Peter that he is going to die by crucifixion. And John's gospel was written probably 2.5 to 3 decades after Peter would have been crucified, executed by
Mm,
crucifixion. So the Gospel of John in the first century, written between 90 and 95, is reporting the death of Peter. Now, if it's written earlier, as some believe, like in the late 60s, then it's written within just a few years of Peter's death.
mm,
But you still have Peter's death in the first century. You have Josephus mentioned the stoning of James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Messiah. So let's see, Josephus, you have Paul, you have John. Um, that's just first century alone. Oh, you've got first Clement. Clement may have been a disciple of the apostle Peter, and he probably mentions the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. Certainly mentions their being persecuted for their faith. And that's really all we need there to say that, look, these people were willing to suffer
mm,
continuously and willing to die for their gospel proclamation. They wouldn't do this for a known lie. They truly
mhm,
believed that he had been raised and had appeared to them. Again, you could say they were hallucinating or lying or whatever, or not lying because they truly believed it. You could say they were hallucinating or whatever reason you want to give. Jesus had an identical twin that deceived them, something. But they truly believed that Jesus rose and appeared to them. And that's just from first century data that shows that they were willing to suffer and willing to die for their gospel proclamation.
mm. One thing I really appreciate about that response, well, and all that you've shared, Mike, is you're very careful with your language and you're not carrying things further, than your methodology, looking at it as it from a historical perspective, and there you even said, that we can have confidence that a number of the disciples, were persecuted and did die for the faith, which doesn't automatically then mean that belief is that their faith is accurate. It just means that more than likely they did not know that it was a lie, because someone
Right.
still might die for a lie, but more than likely won't die for something they know is a lie. So I really appreciate how you're really careful with your vocabulary there. And that's something for those of you watching who are working with kids that I think it's really important for us to make sure we're doing when we're working with kids is sometimes, we just want like rightly so, we want our children to know and love and trust Jesus. We want them to seek and serve him all of the days of their lives because we know that that's what they were designed for. That's what they were created for. That's how they are going to live a life in which they flourish most, even through persecution or suffering or hardship. But sometimes the temptation is we want it all solved in this moment. And so we're like, okay, we're going to show them this data and it's going to be 100% certain. And, like we use very exaggerated language. And sometimes we exaggerate these claims. And we need to be really careful because one day our children are going to be in situations where they realize if we use these exaggerated claims and terms that, like we can't have as much confidence in, then they're going to question, oh, what else did my parents or my pastor or my Christian school teacher tell me that wasn't 100% accurate? So if we can be careful in the language that we are using and teach them to be good investigators, it's not like it doesn't make us feel quite as good because it's not like we hit, like a home run, in one day. But what we're doing is we're running the marathon of helping them understand that Christianity is true. So I would just encourage those of you watching, even if when you get the recording of this, even if you can go back and watch Mike's responses, listen to them again and hear how careful he is with his language. I think that's something that we can really learn from and be really careful of in our own instruction of our children. Mike, anything else you wanted to add before we move on?
Well, I appreciate what you just said. Yeah, I guess I could say, if we don't, when we don't carefully state the facts, if someone who really knows what they're talking about comes and says, "Well, wait a minute now, you're saying the transformed lives of the disciples. What are you basing that on? The Gospels and Acts? Well, I don't believe them." And now, they're willing to throw out the whole thing because you can't defend that, because it doesn't go as far as you want it. But if we're
Mm,
just a little more reserved in what we're stating, we can still state a very strong case. May not be quite as much
mhm.
as tight as we'd like, but it's going to be less susceptible to criticisms that would tear it down.
Yeah, I think that's a really wise way of putting it. Okay, we'll try to get to one more question. Okay, the next question is, my family and my husband's family are all unbelievers and are very much involved in our children's lives. How do I answer my children's question of why so many people reject the truth if the evidence is so strong? Well,
Mhm.
first, Mike, I'd love for you to speak to that because you kind of spoke to it a little bit at the beginning of why
Mhm.
people look at the same evidence and come to vastly different conclusions. So if you could speak to that a little bit more, and then I'll take the second part of the question of how could we then explain that to our kids?
Good, good. Well, we're right back to horizons again, aren't we?
Mhm, mhm,
And it's like, well, what is behind that horizon that would keep them from acknowledging this data for the resurrection of Jesus? So maybe it's they have some political views. Maybe they're pro-choice. Maybe they're pro-LGBTQ kind of stuff, in terms of same-sex marriage and all that, and they see a lot of Christians standing against it. And so their political views are so strong that it prevents them from considering the data in a fair-minded way and to assessing that data. Um, just for example, let's put it on a different level. Let's suppose you're a Muslim woman living in Saudi
mhm,
Arabia, and you have a sister who marries someone, moves to the United States, while over here, has a colleague at work or a neighbor who is a Christian who ends up leading her to Christ. And now she goes back and she's telling her sister in Saudi Arabia, wow, let me share the gospel with you. And the other woman's thinking, well, yeah, but if I became a Christian, my husband would beat me. He might even kill me. In
mhm,
Saudi Arabia, I will pay a horrible price if I become a Christian. And so that fear prevents them from giving the gospel a really good look. So there could be a number of things. Political, could be peer pressure. Maybe they just want to live in such a way that if they became a Christian, and a follower of Jesus, that they wouldn't be allowed to live like they've been living. So
mm,
maybe they're so influenced by the secular culture around them and the way that they have just put down um, a traditional view of Christianity, biblical Christianity, that they just don't. It seems unattractive because it's been
mm,
stereotyped in a false manner. Maybe they had a very bad experience in a church experience before. Maybe they were in a Catholic church where the priest molested the husband or something. I don't know.
mm.
As an altar boy, there could be any number of reasons that contributes to that horizon that keeps them from considering seriously the Christian worldview.
Mm. I think that's so well said because you pointed out like just a host of different reasons, whether it's all of which, related to our worldview, whether it's political leadings that we have, whether it's different experiences that we've had, whether it's different emotions that we've experienced. And I think when we're talking about this with our kids, if we can find something that we know, no matter what data we present to them, they're going to have a hard time swallowing this. That could be a really easy way to talk with them about it. Like, let's pretend you have a child that really loves video games, and you say, you know what? Here, I'm going to show you all of these statistics about how bad video games are for you. Like, and just pull out like three, and walk them through and say, well, what decision do you think we should make about video games in our home based on, these facts? Your child is going to fight tooth and nail, against those statistics about everything that video games do to his brain and his sleep and his social skills, all of those things. And so just find something that your child is very attached to, and then find data, kind of pointing against it. You can even, if you need to, you can even make it up as long as you tell your child immediately afterwards that you made it up. You were just trying to prove a point, and then tell them, this is why sometimes when people are looking at all of this evidence pointing to the resurrection of Jesus, why they're still unwilling to accept it. And so this is something we actually cover in the fourth unit of Foundation Careful Thinking curriculum, talking about, what is actually the threshold for considering something knowledge? What is sufficient evidence? And I learned this the hard way. Actually, when I was reading through Mike's book, I was part of a philosophy group that led by my church where every other Saturday we'd meet up at Barnes and Noble. We were on the Meetup app, and we called it Coffee and Conversation. And we just, talked through a topic with a bunch of atheists and agnostic and spiritual but not religious people, with the goal of like trying to get them to think differently and also just fostering relationships, so we could continue the conversation. And one of the men there was just so adamant, like against Christianity, just had this hatred for Christianity. And I'm new to this, so like there's so much I would have changed if I know what I know now back then. But I was talking with him about all these things that I was learning, in Mike's book, and like he just kept like, skirting around the issue. And eventually I was like, okay, what would you consider sufficient evidence to believe that the resurrection is the most plausible theory of what happened to Jesus? And so then he goes in this long explanation. I would need a team of doctors evaluating the body and reaching a consensus that it is medically dead. And then I would need them, like you need to be hooked up to heart monitors and brain monitors and all these things. And I mean, I wasn't meaning to be rude, but I laughed out loud and I said, oh my goodness, if this is your threshold for understand, like saying we can consider something historically plausible, we can't know anything in history. So even explaining to our kids, that sometimes the evidence people are looking for is just ridiculous. Like we couldn't confirm anything in history if that's what we required. So I think if you can find something they really like, then take them through what Mike talked about, how there's just all of these biases that we already hold on to. And then talk about, like what is the threshold that we need for considering that something to be most likely true. Well, we're almost at the top of the hour, and we really love to keep these things within an hour. So, Mike, is there anything that you would like to leave us with before we head out?
Um, no, I guess one more thing we could say to that last question is if a person doesn't want to believe, it doesn't
Mm,
matter how much evidence they have, right? They've got to
it's
want.
true.
So, I mean, I think it's profitable sometimes to ask, look, if you could know for certain that Jesus
Mm.
rose from the dead, would it make a difference? And if they say
Hmm.
no, well, then you're just wasting your breath.
Yep.
So, just in closing, I'd say, Elizabeth, I'm just so happy about the ministry that you have. I think it's so valuable, and you deal with a segment of the population. It's so vital. What you are doing is so needed because, so many different surveys are showing our kids are just walking away from the faith.
Mm,
They don't have a solid foundation,
mm.
and they're never taught it. And thank you for doing what you're doing.
No, thank you, Mike. Thank you for that encouragement. I appreciate it. And I'm thankful for what scholars like you are doing. I'm just acting as a translator. So, well, thank you to everyone who gave up an hour of your time today. We hope to see you back in a future Foundation Worldview webinar. And until then, my prayer for everyone watching is that no matter the circumstance in which you and the children that God has placed in your care find yourself, that you are trusting that God is working all things together for your good by using those circumstances to conform you more into the image of his son. We'll see you next time.